That's all I owe you." My stepfather said it quietly at the restaurant table, but quietly in a room that small meant 6 people heard it, and 6 people stopped moving at exactly the same moment. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and if you're new here, welcome to Family Shadows. What unfolded that evening was only the beginning of something I hadn't seen coming, and I never would have, if my grandfather hadn't been watching his son's face across a white tablecloth with 30 years of knowing him. My name is Isabel, and for 3 years I had been working toward the 4 letters I was finally allowed to put after my name, CPA. Chartered Professional Accountant. I know that doesn't sound like the kind of thing that makes you pull over in a parking lot and cry, but the night I passed my final exam, that's exactly what I did. Sat in my car outside the testing center in downtown Toronto, with my hands on the wheel, and my chest heaving, because I knew precisely what it had cost me to get there, and I knew I had done every last bit of it alone. Not mostly alone, entirely alone. Every semester of university had been covered through OSAP loans, part-time shifts at a grocery store, and one summer job at a landscaping company that paid just enough to keep me from dropping out. My second year, I went 3 months eating whatever was marked down at the corner store at the end of the night. I applied for every scholarship I could find, stayed up past midnight writing application essays in a drafty apartment with a radiator that only worked when it felt like it. I won 2 of those scholarships. I kept every rejection letter in a folder, because I told myself I would need them someday to remember what it looked like to keep going. My mother had died when I was 11. I don't say that to set the mood. I say it because it's the fact that shapes everything else in this story, the way a crack in a foundation shapes the whole house above it, whether anyone is looking at the foundation or not. She had been sick for a year before she passed, and she had known it was coming. She had time to think things through, to make arrangements, to do what careful mothers do when they understand the odds. At the time, I was 11, so I didn't know what any of those arrangements were. I only knew that she had loved me, and then she was gone. And then I was living in Martin's house, which had technically always been my house too, but which felt different after she left. My grandfather Earl, her father, was a retired postal worker from a small town outside Peterborough. He drove a 15-year-old pickup truck, grew vegetables in a backyard garden every summer, and made butter tarts from scratch that I am not exaggerating when I say were the best thing I have ever eaten in my life. He was not a complicated man. He was an honest one. And he had loved my mother more than he knew how to say out loud, which meant he showed it in other ways, driving 2 hours to Toronto every few months to take me for breakfast, always at a diner with good coffee, always paying without making it feel like a transaction. Martin had married my mother when I was 8. He was not what you would call a villain. He didn't shout or break things or make my childhood frightening. He was simply someone who had looked at me from the very beginning and seen an obligation rather than a child. I was a line in the household budget, a presence at the dinner table, someone he drove to school events and fed and technically sheltered. When I got my first part-time job at 15, he seemed genuinely relieved. When I left for university, he seemed lighter. I told myself that was just his personality, that he was the same way about everything. His son Remy, a year younger than me, whose mother had moved to Vancouver when Remy was small, had grown up in that same house under a different set of rules. Martin coached Remy's hockey on weekends. Martin drove him to tournaments across the province. Martin paid for Remy to attend a private school on the north end of the city from grade 7 onward, the kind of school with a uniform and a waiting list that I had once looked up out of curiosity and immediately closed the browser. I told myself that made sense. Remy was his biological son. I was the stepdaughter. I had no right to expect the same. Or I had made peace with believing that. The celebration dinner was Earl's idea entirely. He had called me the afternoon my designation came through, and his voice on the phone had something in it I hadn't heard in years. He booked a table at a restaurant in Mississauga, white tablecloths and actual candles, because he said I had earned white tablecloths. He invited Martin and Darlene, Martin's second wife, who had come into our lives while I was in my second year of university, and was pleasant the way people are pleasant when they don't really know you, and Remy, who was back from a hockey tournament in Quebec. Earl drove 2 hours from Peterborough with a butter tart pie on his passenger seat the whole way down. Dinner was fine, mostly. Earl told a story about my mother that made me laugh until I had to put my fork down. Darlene talked about the kitchen renovation they were doing. Remy asked me questions about accounting with the specific enthusiasm of someone trying to seem interested. Martin ate quietly and refilled his water glass several times. After the main course, Martin reached inside his jacket. I remember the moment exactly, the way time does something strange right before it changes. He placed a small card envelope on the table and slid it toward me. "Congratulations," he said, one word, the way you'd say it on a form. I opened the envelope. Inside was a card with a generic design and $500 in cash. I looked at the bills. I looked at him. "Thanks, Martin," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. He picked up his water glass. "That's all I owe you," he said, and then he took a sip as if he had just commented on the weather. The table went quiet in a way I will never forget. Earl's hand stopped halfway to his dessert fork. Darlene looked at her plate. Remy looked at me and then away quickly. My face got warm in that particular way that only happens when you're being humiliated in public, and your body has not yet caught up to the fact that you need to hold it together. "That's a strange thing to say," I managed. Martin set down his glass. "I housed you, I fed you, I drove you places for 7 years. I fulfilled what I was responsible for." He wasn't cruel when he said it. He said it the way someone reads a clause they've had a long time to prepare. I looked down at the $500 and thought about every OSAP statement I had ever signed, every scholarship essay, every January when I wore my mother's old coat, because the zipper on mine had broken, and I couldn't justify spending $60 on a replacement. I thought about the butter tart pie Earl had carried on his passenger seat for 2 hours. Earl cleared his throat. "Martin," he said very quietly. Martin folded his napkin. "I'm simply being honest." Earl looked at me across the table, and something in his expression shifted. Not anger. Something older than anger. Recognition. The way a person looks when something they put in the back of their mind a long time ago suddenly comes back with the lights on. He reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. "Come to the house next weekend," he said, low enough that only I heard it. "Just you. Don't mention it to anyone." "Grandpa," I looked at him. "What is it?" "Not here," he said. I drove back to Toronto alone that night, with the $500 on the passenger seat, and my grandfather's expression in my mind and a feeling in my chest I couldn't name but couldn't shake. I drove to Peterborough the following Saturday morning. I hadn't told Martin. I had told only one other person, Joanna, my closest friend since second year of university, who now worked at a branch of one of the big banks and understood money the way I understood tax law, practically, without sentiment, and with a very clear eye for when something didn't add up. Earl was on the front porch when I pulled in. He already had coffee made. He didn't offer small talk, which told me everything. He walked straight to the spare bedroom at the back of the house, the one that had always smelled like old paper and wood polish, and he took a small tin box down from the top of the wardrobe. It was dented and scratched in the way of something that had been moved many times without ever being opened. He set it on the bed between us and sat down. "Your mother gave me this a few months before she passed," he said. He was looking at the box, not at me. "She said she wanted me to have copies of the important documents in case anything ever went wrong. I thought she was being overly cautious. She was always careful that way." He paused. "After she died, I trusted Martin. I assumed he was managing things properly. When you went to university and you seemed to be managing, I assumed the money was flowing through somehow, going toward your tuition, your expenses. I assumed he was doing what he'd been asked to do." "What money?" I asked. He opened the box. Inside were several folded documents, yellowed at the edges, and a sealed letter with my name written across the front in my mother's handwriting. My whole body went still when I saw that. Earl pointed to the documents without touching them. "Your mother had a life insurance policy. She named you as the sole beneficiary." He slid the papers toward me. $150,000. I read the figure twice. I read my name. I read the word beneficiary. "I never received this money," I said. Earl's jaw tightened. "I know that now." He pointed to a section of the will. "She wrote that the funds should be held in trust for you, managed by Martin until you turned 21, then transferred to you. She trusted him to do that. I trusted him to do that." He pressed his lips together. "I never asked him to prove it." I was 21 during my 3rd year of university. I remembered that birthday. Martin had called, asked if I had plans, and when I said I was studying, he said he was glad to hear it, and that was the entire conversation. That spring, I had eaten rice and canned tomatoes for 2 weeks, because I had miscalculated what my last OSAP payment would cover. The drive back to Toronto took 2 hours, and I was barely present for any of it. I had the copied documents in a folder on the passenger seat, and my hands steady on the wheel, and my mind doing the same arithmetic over and over. $150,000, set aside by my mother for my future, missing. I called Joanna from my kitchen that evening, and asked her to come over the next morning. She spread the documents across my kitchen table, and went through them without speaking. When she looked up, her voice was careful. Isabel, a named beneficiary on a life insurance policy. Those funds should have gone directly to you or into a formal trust for your benefit. The trustee had a legal duty to manage that money for you, not for anything else. He didn't, I said. No, she said. It doesn't look like he did. We pulled together everything I had. My OSAP records, my scholarship applications, my financial statements from every year of university, every document that showed I had gone through those 4 years with no financial support from my mother's estate. Then we submitted formal requests to the appropriate provincial offices for the estate accounting records and the complete history of the trust account Martin had been administering. A few days later, I drove to Martin's house and stayed for less than an hour. Darlene made tea. Martin watched the game. We talked about Remy's upcoming playoffs and the construction on the highway near their neighborhood. Ordinary things. Then I mentioned lightly that I had come across a reference to a life insurance policy my mother had held. Just going through some old paperwork, I said, curious about how the estate had been handled. The remote control stopped moving. What exactly are you looking for? Martin asked. I was just curious, I said. I was so young when she passed, I never really understood the details. He looked at me steadily. I handled everything that needed to be handled. I managed your mother's affairs responsibly, and at considerable personal cost. I'd think you would appreciate that rather than going through old records looking for something to question. I picked up my coat. Of course, I said. Thanks for the tea. In the car, I sat for a moment before I started the engine. I had come looking for a reaction, not proof. What I got was close enough. Earl gave me the name of an estate's lawyer in Toronto, a woman named Miss Farrell, who had handled a property dispute for a neighbor of his years back. I brought her everything. She sat with the documents for a long time, and when she finally looked at me, she said, if the financial records support what you're describing, what you're looking at is a trustee who failed in their fiduciary duty to the beneficiary. In Ontario, that carries serious legal consequences. She filed the formal requests for the complete estate accounting, bank records, transaction history, every withdrawal and transfer connected to the trust account. The records came back 10 days later. Ms. Farrell called me into her office on a Thursday and told me to sit before she opened the folder. The account had been opened in the months following my mother's death. The initial deposit was $141,000. The full insurance payout, minus some small administrative costs. Then the withdrawals began. A home renovation the year after my mother died. A vehicle registered to Darlene. 3 years of private school tuition, Remy's school named in the transaction details. A trip to Florida during March break. A second renovation. More tuition. Household expenses described in language so vague they could have covered almost anything. By the time I turned 21, the account held slightly less than $5,000. There was no record of any transfer to me. No communication, no accounting, nothing. I turned the pages slowly. I thought about the scholarship essay I had written in my second year about overcoming financial hardship. I had meant every word of it. I just hadn't known, when I wrote it, how much harder things had been made than they needed to be. Earl wept when I showed him the statements. He sat at his kitchen table with his fist pressed to his mouth and didn't speak for nearly a full minute. Then he said, I should have asked him every year to show me the records. I should have made him account for it. He told you he was managing it properly, I said. He told your mother he would take care of you, he said. That's the part I can't get past. Miss Farrell outlined the options. We could go to court, file a claim for breach of fiduciary duty, let a judge make the determination. Or we could send a formal demand letter first, giving Martin an opportunity to respond before proceedings began. Either path, the documentation made the situation clear. But before either of those things, I asked Earl for something else. I asked him to have the family over for a Sunday dinner. Not to ambush anyone. I simply wanted the truth to be spoken somewhere other than a lawyer's office. I wanted Martin to have to answer with Earl in the room, and Remy and Darlene. Earl invited them by saying he wanted to properly celebrate my designation since the restaurant dinner had ended so awkwardly. Martin agreed without any sign of suspicion. That weekend, Joanna helped me organize the documents by year, marking each withdrawal with a note explaining what it had been used for. I printed 2 full sets. I was not going to make any claims that couldn't be supported by a bank statement. The numbers didn't need my help. Sunday dinner at Earl's house was, for the first 40 minutes, entirely ordinary. The roast, Darlene complimenting the curtains, Remy talking about his team, Martin commenting on traffic on the way down, Earl keeping everyone's water topped up, me eating quietly and waiting. After the plates were cleared, I stood up and picked up the folder from the counter, where I had placed it when I arrived. "There's something I need to go through with everyone," I said. Martin looked at the folder. I spread the documents on the table. I explained what they were. I walked through them one at a time, not rushing. Martin names trustee, the account, the opening balance, the withdrawal dated to the year after my mother's death, the vehicle, Remy's school listed by name, the tuition amounts each year, the Florida receipts, the renovation costs. Darlene had gone very still. Then her voice came out strange and quiet. "Martin, the car, that was from her mother's insurance?" She was doing arithmetic she hadn't expected to be doing at the dinner table. Martin pushed back from the table. I raised her. "Do you have any idea what it costs to raise a child? I made decisions for the household, the way any trustee would." "Trustees manage funds for the beneficiary," I said. "That's the specific legal duty. The beneficiary was me. You were a minor living in my house. I made reasonable decisions. I was a university student on OSAP loans for 4 years," I said, "while this account existed and I had no idea." No one spoke. Remy had picked up the page with his school's name on it. He was reading it. He set it down and looked at his father, and his face was open in a way I hadn't seen from him before. "Dad, that was Isabel's money that paid for my school?" Martin turned toward him. "It's not that simple, Remy." "Was it?" Remy asked. Martin didn't answer. Remy looked at me. His voice was steady but his eyes weren't. "Isabel, I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know." I believed him. And that apology, given simply and with no audience to perform for, broke something in me I hadn't known was still clenched. He hadn't taken anything. He had simply been the child whose school Martin had chosen to prioritize without telling either of us the cost. Martin stood up. His chair caught on the floor and scraped loud in the quiet kitchen. He said we had all turned against him, that he had spent years of his life in that house, and this was apparently how we chose to repay it. Then he went to the front hall, put on his coat and left. The door didn't slam. He just pulled it shut behind him, which was somehow worse. Darlene remained at the table for another minute. Then she gathered her things slowly. She didn't say anything to me before she left, but she also didn't defend him. I noticed both. Remy stayed. He helped Earl clear the table without being asked, and the 3 of us sat together until it got dark outside, and nobody pretended things were fine, but nobody made them worse either. It was the first honest conversation Remy and I had ever had, and it started, strangely, with him asking me what my mother had been like. I told him what I remembered: the perfume, the humming when she cooked, a photograph on Earl's mantle. The legal matter settled out of court. Martin's lawyer, once presented with the full documentation, advised him clearly against a trial. The agreement required him to repay $80,000, secured by a lien against his property, transferred to me on a structured schedule. It was not the full amount, and no number on a settlement document could give back the years I had spent believing there was nothing. No inheritance, no safety net, because I simply had not been worth providing one. But the truth was now official, acknowledged and recorded. The money had existed, the duty had existed, the failure had existed, and now the accounting did too. Earl called me 3 weeks after the settlement was signed, and said he had spoken with his own lawyer. He was signing his cottage over to me, the property outside Huntsville, on the edge of Muskoka, where we had spent 2 weeks every summer when I was small. The dock with the missing board. The loon that called across the water at dusk. He said it wasn't compensation for what Martin had done. He said it was simply his way of making sure I had somewhere solid to stand. I couldn't find words for a moment. Then I said, "Grandpa, you don't have to." "I know I don't," he said. "That's exactly the point." With the first payment from the settlement, I transferred every remaining dollar of my OSAP debt. All of it, on a Tuesday morning in March, in a single transaction. I sat at my desk and looked at the zero balance on the screen and stayed there for a while. I had been carrying that debt since I was 19. It had been such a constant presence that I had stopped registering it as a weight. Only when it was gone did I feel how heavy it had been. I enrolled in a professional development course I had been putting off for 2 years, because I couldn't justify the cost. I opened a separate savings account for a down payment on a place of my own. I started building in a way that felt, for the first time, like it was built on actual ground. Remy and I text now, irregularly but genuinely. He reached out a few weeks after the dinner to say again that he was sorry, in more words this time for longer. I told him he didn't need to. He said he needed to for himself. We're working it out slowly. It's careful, but it's real. The $500 in cash from Martin's card envelope is framed above my desk at home. I've had people ask me why I kept it, let alone framed it. The answer is that I kept it because of what it represented. Not generosity, but the smallest version of me he had ever been willing to acknowledge. He had handed me that envelope at a dinner. My grandfather had baked a pie to attend, and he had said it was all he owed me. And he had believed it, and he had been wrong about it for a very long time. My mother left something for my future. She thought carefully about it while she was still alive, and made sure it was protected and named me and wrote it down in the proper places. Martin had decided, somewhere along the way, that none of that mattered. The $500 on my wall doesn't remind me of him. It reminds me that what someone is willing to give you is not the same as what you're worth. My mother understood that. It just took me longer to find the proof. Before you go, I want to ask you honestly, if you had discovered what I discovered, would you have taken it to court, confronted him privately and kept it within the family? Or would you have taken the settlement, closed the door, and never looked back? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you would have done, and if this story found you at the right moment, subscribe. There are more stories here, and some of them are still finding their way to an ending.